Thank you so much, Claire. Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, my name's Louise and I'm a senior lecturer in forensic science. Specifically, I'm a forensic toxicologist. What means is that I'm really interested in drugs and poisons and how they affect individuals within the body. But yeah, as I mentioned today, I'm going to kind of give you an introduction to what forensic science is and why you might consider it as a potential for higher education study and what careers in forensic science might look like. So I want to begin by having you imagine that you are in South London in 1905 in England. And this street in particular was unfortunately the scene of quite a tragic incident. So on the 27th of March in 1905, this paint store that you can see on the slides was burgled. And the two residents, Anne and Thomas Farrow, were unfortunately assaulted during that burglary. And sadly, they both died as a result of their injuries. During the police investigation into this burglary, they found a discarded cash box upstairs, which is why they believed that kind of theft was the motive for this crime. And this is the cash box that they identified. And as you might be able to see on the image, one of the things that was very readily visible to them was this greasy finger mark on the cash drawer. They examined carefully that finger mark evidence, and they were able to identify that it was the thumbprint belonging to one of the Stratton brothers, Alfred Stratton. And this thumb mark, in combination with the statements, meant that the Stratton brothers were tried for this and found guilty. Now, this was a really big turning point for forensic science, as this was the first time in the UK that finger mark evidence had been used to solve a murder investigation. It was a very new discipline, and it meant that the scientists involved in that investigation had to really explain everything they were doing to convince the court that these individuals had been responsible. Now, since then, since 1902, forensic science is a huge way. We have a vast and broad range of disciplines that sit within forensic science. So, in general, when we are talking about these things, we're talking about the application of scientific analysis to criminal and civil investigations. And what I hope you can perhaps begin to appreciate from such a broad definition is that there are lots of specialized roles within which you could end up working within. And you may have seen kind of TV shows that show forensic science in action. TV shows like Crime Scene Investigation are often very popular. And whilst they are really entertaining and very interesting, and us as forensic scientists do enjoy them, they don't always accurately represent what a forensic scientist actually does. And one of the main things that they somewhat misrepresent is they will suggest that a single individual is responsible for the entirety of the forensic investigation, from crime scene all the way through to court. And that's not actually realistic. What we have instead is a number of specialists that come into the crime scene investigation process at various points and really add their expertise and knowledge to that investigation. So just to talk you through some of the various roles that you could get involved with if you chose to study forensic science. The first is our classic crime scene investigator. So these are the individuals that will go to the scene of an alleged crime. They are responsible for kind of hypothesizing what they think might have occurred there. What actions do they think happened within that scene? And most importantly, what evidence may have been left behind or transferred as a result of those activities. So these individuals are really important for finding that evidence to begin with, and then most importantly, successfully recovering and securing that evidence so that it can be used at a later date within the investigation. This image here is actually one of our CSI students called Sophie, and this was her kind of in one of our simulated crime scenes, actually for a simulated air crash disaster that she was processing on that day. Now, what TV shows often don't kind of recognize is that the CSI is a very separate role then to our forensic laboratory scientists. So this is a different discipline that you could choose to go down. And even within the laboratory aspect of forensic science, there are numerous sub-disciplines as well. So, for example, we have our forensic biologists. Those are individuals who are really interested in biological fluids, and particularly things like DNA and how we can use those to identify individuals and also infer what activity may have occurred during the kind of alleged event. They will often receive kind of garments as a result of the crime scene investigation process, and they will be looking at those really thoroughly and carefully to identify kind of really minute traces of biological evidence that we might be interested in. Separately, there's a whole range of forensic chemists. Forensic chemists typically don't enjoy the kind of more gory side of forensic science. So they try and avoid the biologicals if they can, but they are just as important at looking and identifying and quantifying kind of trace materials. So they might be interested in things like drug residues or perhaps explosive residues. They might be interested in materials such as glass or paint transfer, which can be quite apparent in the scene of, say, a road traffic collision, for example. And so they contribute in a very different way to our forensic biologist. Another subsection of forensic science that's also really important relates to marks and impression examination. And this is where kind of finger mark analysts that we spoke about a few moments ago sit within the kind of world of forensic science. So these are individuals that are comparing marks that have been left behind at the scene with kind of reference prints that we might have recovered from a potential suspect. But as well as finger marks, they also might be looking at things like footwear marks, which can be really important as they can show what footwear has been present within the scene and potentially the direction of travel that that shoe has taken. As you may imagine, in an increasingly digital world, forensic digital specialists are more and more important in the investigation and processing of criminal events. Our digital specialists will kind of mine data from phones and laptops and can be really instrumental in identifying who has had contacts with each other, the types of messages that may have been sent, the locations that those devices may have been at. And so they provide lots of really vital investigative information as well. Additionally, we have a huge range of kind of subspecialists as well. So if you have a really niche area of interest, there is most likely a forensic discipline that would suit you. So, for example, we have individuals that might be blood pattern analysts. Those are experts in looking at the patterns that might be left behind and trying to establish what activity could have led to that blood staining. We have people that are experts in ballistics, so around the use of firearms. We have individuals that are forensic anthropologists who are interested in skeletal remains and trying to identify perhaps the biological sex, the age of that individual, whether they'd had any traumatic events in the run-up to their death. So there's all sorts of areas that you could get involved with forensic science, and it's a really broad and exciting discipline as a result of that. So in general, those forensic scientists that we've just spoken about will be working together to ascertain kind of three key things, the core focus of our forensic investigations. And the first one is whether a crime has actually even been committed. And that might seem really obvious, but actually in practice, this can be more difficult than you might first believe. So for example, in drug offences, is the individual in possession of a controlled substance such as cannabis, or are they just innocently walking around with some dried oregano, which is not controlled? Often separately, sometimes identifying the manner in which someone has died is quite difficult. And so it can be challenging to ascertain whether there was malicious intent from other individuals. And so it can actually be more challenging to establish whether a crime has been committed than you might think. If a crime has been committed, our next kind of focus is who is responsible. Can we find any evidence to potentially identify who was present at a scene, who was involved in certain activities? And if we do have an individual that we believe is responsible, does the evidence support, and most importantly, does it refute a prosecution? And that's the real big aspect of forensic science that makes it such an interesting discipline. We have to remain impartial and objective scientists when we are processing investigations. And so we do not work for one side or the other. Our duty is to the court and to a kind of true and just outcome. And so what that means is we're not just looking at evidence that might support a prosecution, but we're also assessing that evidence to see if it kind of refutes what the prosecution is saying has happened. And that can make the interpretation really interesting, but also really challenging. Now, in terms of how we actually go about doing these things, how do we establish if there's evidence to support or refute a prosecution? This all comes down to a fundamental underpinning idea of forensic science that was theorized by a scientist called Edmund Locard in 1920. And this is what Edmund Locard said. He said, "No one can act with the force that the criminal act requires without leaving behind numerous signs of it. Either the wrongdoer has left signs at the scene of the crime or has taken away with him, on his persons or clothes, indications of where he has been or what he has done." Now, that is a translation. The original is in French. But in forensic science, we have shortened that and made a succinct phrase that kind of everyone who works in the industry is aware of. And that phrase is, "Every contact leaves a trace." And this is what the entirety of forensic science is based on. If I was to commit an assault, I would be transferring evidence of my person, the items I'm wearing, into that scene, but also I'd be taking evidence away. And it's that evidence, that transfer, that we're really looking for. And that there's a huge variety of materials that can be transferred there. Most people are familiar with things like DNA, with biological fluids, with finger marks, some of the more commonly and widely known evidence types. But there's also a huge variety of things that people wouldn't normally consider. Things like fibers from my clothing, any cosmetics that I might be wearing, soils and pollens if I've traveled through kind of an overgrown area before the event or afterwards, I'm going to be picking up those materials. And in the UK, a number of serious crimes have been solved by some of these more unknown evidence types. For example, we had a killer who was caught as a result of pollen and soil within the wheel arches of his car, which linked him to the area where the event had occurred. So all of these tiny pieces of material are really important to try and in trying to ascertain what may have happened and who may have been involved. And most importantly for us, we've had significant advances in our technologies over the past kind of 50 years, which means that we're no longer even required to have visible material, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be forceful contact for that transfer to happen. Because we can detect the most minute traces of material, we can gain so much information from a single crime scene. So, for example, kind of when DNA was in its infancy, we needed a blood stain about the size of a 2p piece in terms of UK currency, to be able to get a DNA profile. But now a single skin cell is sufficient. So even as I'm talking now, kind of some spit will be coming out of my mouth that will contain epithelial skin cells, which we would be able to get DNA profiles from. Even just a simple touch on a surface will leave enough DNA for forensic scientists to gain a profile and identify that individual. This material transfer is really readily apparent, and we're able to detect just even tiny amounts of this. Now, the most crucial aspect of this theory that I want to express to you is that the theory recognizes that the transfer of those items is two-way. So it's not just what the perpetrator brings to the scene, but also what they take away with them. And what that means is it gives us this opportunity to combine this evidence, and it makes it much more likely, if you find evidence of the scene on the person and evidence of the person within the scene, that they were the one responsible for that act, rather than just a coincidental finding. So let's consider kind of a little case example quickly. So let's imagine we have an individual who's walking home with their kind of shopping bags, and another individual runs at them and tries to take that bag. there's a struggle before the assailant is able to take the purse out of the bag before fleeing. Now, I want you to think for a moment about what kind of evidence might have transferred within the course of that event. So the kind of things that we might have seen would potentially be DNA transfer. If there has been kind of contact between the assailant and the victim, there's a chance that skin cells will have transferred between the two, and particularly if that victim kind of struggled or tried to defend themselves. Often we might find that skin cells can be captured underneath fingernails, for example, for us to then gain DNA profiles from. If either party was injured during that event, we may have had biological fluids transfer. If there's been contact between garments of clothing that either party is wearing, then two-way transfer of those fibers could happen. And also, in this case example, the individual has left the bag behind. And so it may be that we have finger marks from the perpetrator on that bag that we can enhance and detect. And that's what we're going to focus on for the next little activity. So what we're going to have a go at doing is enhancing our own finger marks, either at home or in class if you're in the laboratory. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change my camera over so you can see what I'm doing slightly. But you should hopefully on your desks have a piece of paper and either some cocoa powder or some flour available. When you're kind of retrieving your piece of paper, try not to touch it too much in the middle and just keep holding onto it at the edge for me. So I have my piece of paper here, and I will just kind of give you a second to get your materials as well. I'll wait for a wave from Claire when you guys are ready. Awesome, all looks good. So what we're going to do is we're firstly going to deposit our own finger marks. Now, before we start with that, when we deposit finger marks, we want to be nice and gentle with the pressure. And the reason for that is because the tips of your fingers are what we call malleable. So that means they'll move around. So if you press really hard, what you'll actually do is end up kind of squishing all of the areas of interest within your finger mark together, and you'll get a mark that's quite difficult to read. So we're going to do a nice gentle pressure. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to leave a natural finger mark. So this is just the finger marks as they are right now. So what I want you to do is take your hand, and on the left-hand side of your page, I just want you to very gently press down with a few of your fingers like that, and that will leave your natural finger mark. Perfect. Looks good. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to deposit what are called in the industry loaded marks. And these are marks where we increase the amount of sebaceous, which are kind of our fatty oils, on our finger marks. So what I want you to do to load up your finger mark is either to rub your fingers behind your ears. If you don't have cosmetics on, you can also do your forehead. That can be quite a good place. So you're going to kind of load up your finger marks and then rub your hands together to distribute those oils on your fingers. And then this time on the other side of your page, on your right-hand side of your page, you're again going to nice and gently deposit your finger marks. Fantastic. Now, I'll be truthful, in industry, we do have slightly fancier powders than this, but finger mark enhancement powders, so how we take those currently invisible marks that you've left on your paper and turn them into something that we can visibly see, is essentially powders that are just very fine particulate material. And so we can replicate this with a number of things that we will find around the house. So you may have either flour, cocoa powder, talcum powder can also work really well. And so what you're going to do is just very gently sprinkle this powder over the top of where you left your marks. So you don't need too much, but just where you deposited those marks, I want you to sprinkle some powder over the top. And then all you're going to do is pour that excess away. So you should have somewhere on your bench where you can dispose of any excess. I have a little bin down to the side of me. So you're going to tip off that cocoa powder, and you're going to potentially tap the back of your piece of paper just to get rid of some of that excess. Now, hopefully, you should be able to see some finger marks have developed. So if I just show you some of the ones that I have here, you can see where my finger marks have been enhanced. And what I would like you to do is have a look at these, and using what we use is something called Menti. I would love you to kind of interpret your marks a little bit. So if on your kind of internet-enabled device that you have, you go on www.menti.com and type in the code that you can see on the screen, it should take you to a series of questions where you can tell me which of your marks recovered kind of better. And then I want you to think about why we might have got this finding. So I'm just going to change my camera back to my face. There we go. And yeah, I would like you to look at whether your natural marks or your loaded marks enhanced more thoroughly. And then I want you to start thinking about why that potentially happened. Why has one worked better than the other? So once you go onto the Menti, you'll see that it starts asking you some questions, and you should be able to work your way through the slides. So if you've popped in which ones have enhanced better, you can then move to the next slide and start putting your suggestions in as to why you think we've seen those differences. I can see some answers are coming through already, so that's really great. Well done, everyone. You will notice as well that there's a third slide, which is open for any questions that you might have. So feel free to pop things in there as well if you would like to. So I'll just give you a couple more moments to think about your answers to those questions. There are some really good answers coming in already, so well done for those of you that have already answered those. Okay, so if we just think about what we've done there, hopefully you haven't made too much of a mess. I can't say that my desk is perfectly clean now, but it looks like, looking at the kind of responses to your questions, that most of you saw much better enhancement for our loaded marks rather than our natural marks, which is absolutely what we would expect to see. And in terms of why that happens, there are lots of really excellent answers on the Menti page. So some really good thinking by all of you. Well done. And essentially, you've all kind of got the correct answer there, where because we've loaded up our marks with these, they're called sebaceous substances, it's those sebaceous oils that the fingerprint powder is kind of adhering to. That's what it's grabbing onto. And that's why we're able to see those ones much better. In terms of kind of how finger marks are deposited, we do have a number of pores on the tips of our fingers that release kind of proteins and waters and oils and things like that. And it's that which sits on the ridges of our fingertips and which is deposited when we touch a surface. Now, as you might imagine, criminals don't typically rub their hands all over their face before going around and kind of touching surfaces for us to find. So the natural mark is more likely what we would see in general crime scene examination. The only kind of exception to that is that typically when an individual is kind of perpetrating a criminal act, they are having some form of physiological response to that. So they are usually a little bit stressed. They may have been running or kind of jumping over things, and so they will naturally be sweating a little bit more, and so they do tend to leave slightly better marks behind in the scene as a result of that. Now, in terms of what a finger mark expert would now do, now that you've enhanced your finger marks, one of the first things that we're looking to establish is potentially who left that mark. So can we identify the individual? And to do that, they will look much more deeply at the patterns and the low-level detail on the finger mark ridge themselves. Now, we don't have time to do that today, but I have shared a worksheet with your teachers, which would enable you to have a look at your finger marks in more detail if you would like to. As long as you don't directly rub your cocoa powder or your flour on your page, your finger mark will sit quite happily. So if you wanted to come back to that in a few hours' time and have a look in more detail, you're more than welcome to do that. And I've provided your teachers with some more information to help you with that. But from a forensic science perspective, once we have that identification, that's usually not the end of the kind of story. And often there are some really interesting interpretation challenges that we need to address. Most importantly is potentially why your finger mark is there. Just because your finger mark is at the scene of a crime or perhaps on an item that was used in a criminal venture doesn't necessarily mean that you are actively involved yourself. One of the most interesting parts about finger marks is how long they will persist on surfaces. So if they are not disturbed, they will remain quite happily for a number of years. And we had a forensic expert give a talk to our students a few months ago where he had found finger marks on a surface that had been there for 15 years. So often now it's less about whose finger mark it is, whose DNA is it, and more about why did it get there, what activity could have led it to be there, and is there potentially an innocent explanation for that presence. And that's what's made forensic science so interesting as we've developed over the past 50 years and our techniques have got better, because that interpretation is much more at the forefront of what we do. The other thing that we have to really consider is how we then apply this information in a criminal case, for example. So I believe in Thailand, your criminal justice system is determined by a judge. In the UK, we have what's called a layperson jury. So we have members of the community are selected at random to sit on a jury and they will decide the outcome of that criminal case. And that judge and the jury may not be scientifically trained. So they may not necessarily readily understand the scientific techniques that we have applied in our forensic investigation. And so often as the forensic scientist and the expert witness, you have to translate some really complex scientific ideas into much simpler terms so that the court can understand exactly what you've done and why. We also have to be really precise and specific with our language to ensure that we don't misrepresent the evidence. So, for example, you're all sat in a classroom right now. If there was a burglary in that classroom tonight, all of your finger marks would be there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you were the ones who were involved with it. And so we have to be really careful with our language in forensic science, just to say that this individual perhaps made contact with this item, rather than extrapolating that to say they were involved in this criminal venture. So it's a really useful skill set that you start to develop about how best to communicate those ideas. So if you've enjoyed that finger mark enhancement practical, you might be thinking about why you would want to study forensic science and why you might be interested in pursuing this further. So in terms of what the role is like, it's an incredibly dynamic and ever-changing discipline. So if you're the kind of person that enjoys learning new things and developing your skills continually throughout a career, then a discipline like forensic science could be a really good fit for you. It's also a discipline that has real societal impact. You will have significant impact on the lives of a number of individuals and the justice that sits within your community. And that can be something that's really rewarding to be involved with. Kind of furthermore, no 2 days are the same, and you often end up with some really interesting stories to share at parties. People are often very interested if you have a job in forensic science and they want to hear all about the things that you get up to. But perhaps most importantly, forensic science is what we call an applied science. And that means it's typically a very practical oriented course where you get lots of hands-on experience through simulations and laboratory work. And you get to do all that with this very interesting criminal case context, usually kind of attributed to it. So that can make studying the course for some students a lot more interesting and a lot more accessible than perhaps some of the very pure theoretical courses in the pure sciences that you might also be looking at. So yeah, if you're a student that prefers kind of hands-on learning and you're very practical oriented, then an applied science discipline like forensic science might really suit you. The additional benefit of some of these applied science courses is that you develop a wealth of skills that employers are looking for. So it can be really, really great for looking at other industries as well. So in terms of the kind of skills that a forensic science student would develop, as you might expect, you'll get technical knowledge and ability on a wide range of kind of analytical and biological instrumentation. But also you learn things like how to adhere to quality standards and procedures. As hopefully you can imagine, quality within forensic science is a hugely important aspect. And so we have to work really carefully throughout. We also do some very complex data interpretation, as well as I spoke about before, this ability to communicate to a really wide variety of audiences. A forensic scientist can go from a conversation with a fellow scientist about how to develop a method or how to interpret that data, to conversing with someone who's got no scientific training at all and having to explain their ideas and their theories. We're also very detailed record keepers. There are big requirements for within the industry that all of your steps or processes have been recorded and there's a full audit trail. So that can be a really useful skill to develop. And you never know how a crime is going to progress. And so that means that we're often having to adapt and problem solve as new variations kind of come into the laboratory or to the forensic suite. And so what I'd really love for you to recognize here is that these skills are not just relevant for forensic science, but are hugely transferable to other industries as well. Some of the scientific skills work fantastically well in environmental fields as well as pharmaceutical industries, but also many of these skills are needed external to science as well. So the data analysis skills can be really helpful for large corporations in terms of their business intelligence. Your communication skills could develop you into a fantastic teacher and educator, or maybe a science journalist. So essentially what I'm saying is by studying a forensic science degree, you're not limiting your options to only being a forensic scientist. It can open a huge number of doors in other careers for you as well. If you're looking to potentially pursue a career in forensic science, there's probably some information that might be helpful for you. So, for example, when you head into sixth form, you will want to probably choose a science qualification in either biology or chemistry. That's usually the kind of entry requirement for a career in forensic science. A degree at university would then be highly recommended. Now, you may see on some websites that discuss forensic science careers that you don't have to have a degree. And they are absolutely right. You don't have to have a degree for the apprentice level, entry level positions. However, you will find that your career progression would be limited without a degree, as it's often required for your expert witness status and your court reporting. So if you're looking for a long, successful career in forensic science, I would definitely recommend a degree before going into the industry. Now, there are two university routes that you could take. You could take an undergraduate degree known as a BSc in forensic science specifically, or you could do a BSc in a different science. So you could do your undergraduate degree in chemistry or biology, and then follow that up with postgraduate study specifically in forensic science to convert your scientific knowledge. Both routes are just as successful and kind of depends on your interest and personal preferences, but I'm more than happy to advise if anyone has any specific questions relating to that. For some of the specialist disciplines that I spoke about earlier, such as, say, forensic anthropology or forensic toxicology or digital specialists, it might be that a further postgraduate specific degree in that field is also beneficial for your career. As you prepare for any applications to university or potentially the workplace, you may find that having some work experience is helpful for getting those positions. Now, gaining work experience within the forensic industry specifically is incredibly challenging due to the fact that there's often a lot of regulation and control about who can work in that field. So what my advice would be is to really think about the transferable skills. So think about any industry where you might follow a standard method, for example. So if you could get work experience in any type of laboratory, then following standard methods would be a part of that. But also those kind of processes would apply anywhere else as well. So if you're working in a supermarket and you are involved in the kind of following the cashing up process and the audits around kind of money control, that would apply as relevant work experience. Similarly, think about those communication skills. Any form of communication of a more complex idea to a simpler form would be a fantastic kind of area to get involved with. So perhaps you might tutor for younger students, or maybe you coach a sports team or anything like that. Could be really valid work experience for these kind of careers. Another aspect is that we're always looking for people that are detail oriented. So if you're really interested in art and you do some fantastic detailed fine art drawings, that can also be really relevant to a career in the sciences, even though it might not always feel that way. So if you did choose to pursue a degree in forensic science, as I've mentioned before, there are a huge range of graduate prospects for you. So these are just some examples of what our students have gone on to do after graduating. And as you can see, it's a really big and varied list. But one of the things I would point out to you is how many of those students are doing things outside of forensic science. So we've got students who are working as science teachers, students that now work in the health service as biomedical workers. We have students that work in environmental industries, lawyers. So as I mentioned before, taking a forensic science degree does not limit your options and can actually open a huge variety of doors for you. If any of you are interested in pursuing this as a career option and a potential study option, I have collated a few additional resources for you that you might be interested in. And I've sent a list of these to your tutors as well, so that they can provide you with the links if you would like. There's some really fun books to read. So When the Dogs Don't Bark is a really interesting book written by a very experienced, very well-regarded forensic scientist that talks about her career and some of the cases that she's worked on and how robustness in forensic science is so important. Along the bottom, there are the logos from a number of our professional societies in forensic science across the world. So there's an Asian Forensic Science Network, as well as the American Academy of Forensic Scientists. I've also included the Chartered Society of Forensic Science, which is the UK-based one. But those professional bodies will often run free webinars and can be a really great place to network and meet people who work in that industry, and maybe find a mentorship kind of opportunity. The other thing that I would say is, if you're really looking to stand out in a university application, engaging with things like there's a Netflix series of documentaries called The Innocence Files, which follows the work of the Innocence Project. And if you're not able to watch the documentaries, at least engaging with the Innocence Project and the work they do can be really important. The reason for that is because people often think that forensic science is this infallible discipline that is always correct and we always get the right outcome, when actually that's really not the case. And there have unfortunately been numerous miscarriages of justice due to poor forensic evidence, either in the reporting or the actual analytical work that was done to begin with. And so if you're able in an application to these programs to reflect critically on the use of forensic science, where its limitations are, how you might like to be involved in improving that situation, then that will make you stand out significantly compared to other candidates that are applying for the same programs. But as I said, I've sent all of this information over to your tutors as well. So if you are interested, please do ask them, and they will be able to share that information with you more widely. But otherwise, thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. The Menti does give you the option to ask questions if you would like to, or you can ask your teachers in the room or put one in a chat box, kind of wherever they come. That's absolutely fine. I can't hear you, Claire, sorry. I think you might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions? I've got just a nosy question. Just interested to hear about, kind of some of the, one of the most interesting cases that you've worked on.
So personally, I'm an academic forensic scientist, which means that I haven't worked in professional practice myself, but a number of my colleagues have. So I can share one of those if that's all right. Actually, one of our recent graduates, she now works as a forensic toxicologist, and she was focused in family drug testing and workplace drug testing. So that's where we're looking potentially at long-term drug usage within an individual to see if they're adhering to custodial arrangements with their children, for example. And this individual decided to avoid his drug test by sticking his head in a large vat of cement to make his hair unusable for the test, which in itself is quite a suspicious behavior to do, and also didn't stop the test because we have other samples that we can take instead. But that comes to mind as kind of an interesting one. And that's why when I said about kind of being adaptive and flexible, you never know what someone's going to do. So we always have to solve problems and think about how we might approach this random situation.
Wonderful, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly run over to the screen and see if we've got any other questions from the external viewers. Let's have a look.
I'll double check my one as well.
Okay. Lots of thank yous. Thank you for the presentation. Any questions, anybody? I was going to ask.
We have one coming, I think.
Excellent. Do you want to turn on the mic?
She's typing. I don't think her mic is working.
Okay.
So when you look at evidence, when you're investigating, do you have to avoid bias, or how do you try to avoid bias?
That's a really insightful question. Yes, you absolutely do. Bias is a huge issue in forensic science. And what we particularly are concerned about is something called cognitive bias. So this is where you can be influenced in your kind of perception based on preconceived notions and beliefs. So often forensic scientists will be limiting the amount of contextualizing information that they're aware of to ensure that they can remain as objective and impartial as possible. There's been a really big amount of research done by a professor called Professor Draw, who does lots of fantastic work in bias in forensic science. And he's a really great speaker. So if you find any of his YouTube videos, I definitely recommend them. But he did a large study focused on forensic anthropology, and he was particularly looking at whether contextual information influenced the anthropologist's outcome as to whether the skeleton was a biological female or biological male. And they found that if they gave the skeleton on its own, 70% would say female and 30% would say the skeleton was male. If they provided that same skeleton but with contextualizing information, such as it was found with kind of feminine jewelry or clothing indicated kind of feminine clothing, that the percentage that were reporting that that skeleton was female massively increased. So that contextual information was clearly having an influence in the result that those scientists were reporting. And that's the same in all of the disciplines, that idea. We shouldn't know, for example, if an individual has previous criminal convictions. We shouldn't know about their age, their ethnicity, all of those things which could influence a forensic scientist. We try and avoid to minimize bias. But it is a huge issue and one that we work on still massively today.
Thank you. That was a great question. Anna, did you have another one coming?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay.
I think one might have just come in the chat. Sorry, Claire. So the question is, at the end of your case, do you get to know if the criminal was arrested/convicted or not? Theoretically, you can, but it's not something that's directed towards you. So it's information that you would have to go and find yourself. Often forensic scientists are working on potentially 20, 30 cases at a time, and they're continually working on them even whilst the court process is going on. So more often than not, you actually forget about the case itself and you forget to ask for an outcome, but you can find out if you're wanting to. And I think for some cases that particularly stick with scientists, they would look to see what the outcome had been.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, no more questions from the floor? Any more questions? No? So can everybody just give a huge thank you to Louise. Really, really appreciate your time today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me.
It was so interesting hearing about the various career routes, not limited to forensic science. So it's food for thought for a lot of our students. Those of you who are attending remotely, we will send the video recording because I think we did have a little bit of a problem with sound at the start, Louise. So we will send the recording, and also those that joined remotely, I have sent you should, as part of the meeting link, you should have received the extra reading list that Louise referred to. You guys, RFT guys, I will send that to you as soon as possible. So thank you once again, Louise. Really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
No problem at all. Bye, everyone.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Bye.